Today's sponsor is Campfire Blaze. Now you might be familiar with Campfire, which I've actually mentioned in a previous video. An incredible writing and world building tool that helps you keep track of your setting, your plot, your characters, basically solving the difficulty that writers like myself have when trying to keep track of these large stories that we end up writing. Well, Campfire Blaze takes all those features and they are improving upon them, and they have launched a new Kickstarter that they've asked me to let you know about. This new version of Campfire Blaze, adds great new features like being able to add in magic systems as part of the actual story world structure that you're creating in this wonderful writing program. But not only that, it has new features like keeping track of fantasy languages, and it also has its own inbuilt word processor, which means you can write your entire story in this system and have all your references, world building documents, character bios, world maps, fantasy maps, all there, easily accessible and easy to bring up. Campfire Blaze is going to be a browser-based web app where you only pay for those specific features that you want to use in a subscription style model. So not one flat fee where you are forced to pay for features that you don't use, you only pay for those things that you want, which makes it far more manageable and far more affordable. You'll be able to collaborate with others online, and it features cloud-based saving. And if you're a writer like me, having your, your document, your story saved in the cloud is a lifesaver. The greatest horror I could ever imagine was losing my manuscript when it was halfway done, ugh. So please do go check out the Campfire Blaze Kickstarter. This product comes highly recommended by me. There's a link in the description below.
Shadowverse.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and I want to talk about one of the most epic, the most iconic fantasy swords in all of pop culture, and that is the Power Sword from He-Man. I mean, my goodness. I'm a partial child of the 80s. I was born in 1985, but He-Man was still being rerun quite actively throughout the 90s, and so I really got into He-Man as a kid. And I mean, think about this, okay? You know I love swords, all right? And this is a magical sword that bestows incredible powers upon the wielder, and it is also the key of transformation, that, with the sword, you raise it above your head and say one of the most iconic, phrases in all pop culture.
By the power of Grayskull!
Oh, that transformation sequence still gives me goosebumps. It is just epic. And the ultimate versions, I know there was like a remade version of He-Man, which actually, it wasn't too bad. I'm not talking about the sci-fi one, I'm talking about the later remade one that was like made in the early 2000s. The transformation sequence had nothing on the original, nah. And then you turn into one of the most powerful beings of all pop culture, He-Man. And I mean, seriously, when it comes to the 80s and stuff, superheroes, they had no limits. They did crazy things. I mean, there's one point He-Man reverses the flow of a tornado by running around it in the opposite direction. He's basically on Superman levels of insanity and power and strength. Well, Superman goes even further. He's moving planets. Yet still, He-Man is way OP. Now, I don't necessarily say that as a feature of the thing. I think, to make superpowers enjoyable and have good conflict in the story, your hero does need good limitations. But I'm just saying He-Man is awesome. All right? He's totally awesome. And one of the other things that I love about He-Man, this is a bit dumb, okay? But I love that it's an unashamed kind of boy cartoon. It's a wish fulfillment fantasy, and there's no shame at all. We're gonna have this guy, an Arnold Schwarzenegger, Conan-esque kind of hero, and we're just gonna have his muscles all out in the open. There's no shame here at all. And that's a buff guy. I want to be buff, and so I love it. And it was a cartoon that was unashamedly made for boys. And also the original She-Ra as well, on that note. Unashamedly made for young girls. And even the Arrow guy has love hearts and everything, all in the design. So now that I'm kind of getting through my pop culture nostalgia fanboying and stuff, let's break down the most important kind of element of He-Man, and that is the Sword of Power itself. And like I said, this is one of the most iconic swords in all of fantasy, but I want to break down its design to actually pull it apart. Is this a good design, okay? And if it's not, which it's not,
That's how I feel!
we're going to redesign it, but with the express purpose of keeping the aesthetic, the style, make it the new design look properly like the power sword. So off the bat, I need to say, like, if you were to just look at the shape and not balance it against what proper sword proportions should be for it to be a functional sword, this is actually a very elegant design and shape for an object, which is exactly what I think they were going for. Yet, having said that, the design, the elegance of this sword seems to be at, a bit of odds, a bit of a contradiction to He-Man's overall aesthetic. He is this Conan the Barbarian type of warrior, yet his sword looks like it belongs to a princess or a noble knight in really fancy shining armor. So there's that kind of visual clash that I have between the sword and He-Man. Now, as a kid, I didn't really care. It's like a cool sword, cool hero, and I wasn't really paying attention to visual cohesiveness. But, alright, so there's that meant to mention. But when we actually look at the power sword in regards to effective functional sword design, oh boy, there are, well actually I was going to say there are a few swords that are as deformed in regards to what a sword should look like compared to what it actually is than the power sword, but there are some pretty close contenders like Frostmourne from World of Warcraft. So what is wrong with its design and proportions? It's the weight distribution, okay? We have a huge hunk of mass right above the handle. It's really kind of bulbous and stuff. Now, that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing because He-Man has insane superhuman strength. But if we were just looking at this from the perspective of a regular person picking it up, the weight that exists above the handle is really over the top. And what's even strange about this, then it tapers really sharply inward to a very narrow blade. For someone as strong as He-Man, that's almost like a weird contradiction because he doesn't need a small prissy blade. It's super strong. It would need to be really, really big. And so there's this weird contrast where it seems a little too small for someone for He-Man's strength, and yet for someone with normal strength, the blade width is probably appropriate, but then you have that bulbous kind of, it's not really the cross, it's the hilt makeup, right, of the sword is really bulbous and overweight. And then, of course, it doesn't really have a pummel. It's like a little pummel, but it's not really a pummel. It's more like just a small little cap to stop the hand slipping down too far, which you could say that is kind of a pummel. It's closer to like the kind of pummel you see. It's an end cap, okay? I'm gonna call it an end cap, not a pummel. Yet even with this strange design, there are certain design elements that we can look at and, capture, like, all right, we can duplicate that, but fix this sword, improve it, make it better, all right? Now, what some of the key visual elements of this sword is the kind of diamond flaring out sections just above the hilt. You can have that on a sword and still have it be fully functional and practical and not go as far as what we see the power sword going. And then on top of that, separate to the kind of diamond section, you have these two side-like wings, and in the cartoon, those wings are connected to the top and bottom with like two spheres, tiny little spheres, balls. He-Man has balls on his sword. Now, I'm not the only one who feels that the power sword, as depicted in the original cartoon, needs to be redesigned a bit. And to give credit to some of these designs, I'm going to show them to you because some of them are actually pretty good. They're not exactly where I would take the design, which is why I still design my own version, which I'll show you, but I want to give credit to some of the redesigns. And the first one that I'm going to give credit to is actually the version of the power sword in the live-action He-Man movie with Dolph Lundgren. You say what you want about Masters of the Universe, the live-action He-Man movie, okay? I saw this as a kid and I loved it, and I'll be forever tainted by nostalgia and my juvenile love of this movie. Yes, look, we could break it apart and probably see that it's real, but because I had such love for this movie as a kid, it's so hard for me not to love it now, because the things why I loved this movie as a kid, it was He-Man in real life. I didn't have high, standards back then. And not only that, it was like He-Man coming to our world and then just kind of kicking some butt in our world. And he had a really cool sword. There's some issues with it, but I tell you what, the Skeletor guy, I forget who played Skeletor, he was awesome, okay? Now, the sword varied a decent amount from the original design of the cartoon, but if you just look at the sword itself, It's actually a pretty solid sword design for a fantasy style sword. There are certain elements which would work against it, all right? But those can be easily overcome. If I was to give, a concession here and there, this is actually a pretty solid and, dare I say, functional sword design. Well, the elements that would make this quite, impractical is how bulbous those elements are in the crossguard. If you were to just kind of flatten them, so you have this is the sword facing front on it, and you turn it on the side and then just squish that crossguard down, keep the indentation and design still there. So the indents on this crossguard, instead of sticking up like that, if you were to just flatten, that'd still be a small point, so you get the flavor, but you make it much thinner. You could reduce the weight of this crossguard by almost 2/3, and then if you give that sword a proper distal taper, it could actually be a decently functional sword. It's pretty broad. You might want to give it a small profile taper, but you don't necessarily need to. He-Man is tough and you want this sword to do serious damage. This is actually a really solid design. The flaw in it is how different it is from the original. But there are certain elements in this design that, give a bit of a nod to the original. And that's the kind of side parts that come up on the sword. We would technically call this the ricasso, but it's really almost like side quillins that border the ricasso of the sword on either end. And if you're wondering the ricasso of the sword, it's a blunted portion of the sword just above the hilt. And that's a design element that we do see on the original design of the power sword, which are these two kind of side portions on either side of what you could kind of call the ricasso of the blade. But it's a bit hard to call the ricasso because there's no proper crossguard on the sword. But anyway, we could call it that. But then this sword actually adds an additional functional element, and that's quillins, two actual proper side quillins, which gives the power sword a crossguard of some type, which is good. Crossguards are good. They're good, they're functional, they add versatility to the sword, and so because of that, the power sword from the live-action He-Man movie, awesome design right there, but it's too aesthetically different from the original, and I would want to keep that kind of visual similarity to make it still distinctly, that is the power sword, because it's been too far removed, unfortunately. But in its own interpretation, yes, of course, it can still be the power sword. I like there to be visual cohesiveness. And one of the other designs which has attempted this, and if you just look it up online, I don't know who made it, this is just me finding it on Google and looking like, this is a good design. Is this one right here? This is someone's attempt at making the power sword more functional and practical. And I agree, that's actually a really good attempt. They have disconnected the kind of side bordering weird kind of up quillins that are on the side of the power sword to the point where they actually do look like up quillins and they're not connected by the circles, and then it has the distinct diamond-like shape there still. Personally, I think the diamond part of the blade is still too big, adding too much weight to the sword, and its proportions are just a little bit skewed for my own likings. I would like there to be a little more balance in just the visual weight that we see here and just weight overall. But still, when we look at this redesign, we can very much still see this as the power sword. So I think it's really great. Now, all right, what would I do? How would I redesign the power sword to make it far more practical and functional, yet clearly making it look like the original design? Well, first of all, something that I find rather odd about the power sword is that it's one-handed. Now, He-Man regularly doesn't use a shield. I think there are some instances where he does, but for the larger majority of everything, He-Man is basically never using a shield. And so the fact that this is a one-handed sword is a bit baffling if it's his main weapon. This should be a two-handed sword, which means larger blade, more damage, and then he can use two hands on it. Now, is that necessary? Because He-Man is so strong, he could actually use a two-handed sword with one hand with ease. I agree completely, but he has all the strength of his offhand, okay? So even if he could use it one hand normally, as soon as he adds that other hand, well, it's just double the power he can put behind this blade. And then it's a simple matter of just staying true to authentic practical sword proportions while keeping the same visual style. Now, you've seen the 3D model I made of the original, all right, side by side, this is the original, and this is my redesign that I modeled in SketchUp. What do you think? I'm pretty happy with the design overall. It is very visually distinctly the power sword. You can see it has the same visual style. It's a full kind of metal sword with even still the metal handle as well, but the handle has the proper kind of molding and shape, so it's better and easier to grip. Now, you'll have noticed I actually took a leaf out of the live action He-Man sword and added proper side quillins to this sword design because it's just a very functional, practical element. And then I kind of took a leaf out of the other design, and I don't think I would have needed to see this other design to realize that, yeah, you could do these side elements of the power sword and disconnect them at the top, and then they're kind of side up quillins. That is a design feature that I naturally came to myself, and it is similar to this other one, but so I'll give credit to the other designer that did it. And then you have the diamond shape of the lower part of the blade with the internal kind of design ridge that the original sword has, and that the blade slightly tapers with an additional kind of feature, fantasy-esque like tip to the blade. This will add a little bit more weight, but that means more presence in the cut at the tip, and it has the same kind of visual style to the sword overall. I removed those weird spheres, okay? To me, it was those spheres that really made the sword look more bauble-like, more elegant, and which was at conflict to me with He-Man's aesthetic. Now, my redesign is still very elegant, but it's not like super elegant. It still has an edgy feel to it. It's a sword, edgy makes sense, don't you think? And it just suits the kind of He-Man style a bit more while still staying true to the original design style. Now, I do admit the addition of those side quillins does change the overall look a little bit, and if you feel that it is too much, here is a variant without those side quillins and an additional variant on those two versions with a little bit more color. I know the original doesn't have that color, but it's a very small change and it kind of just makes the sword look a little bit more fancy. So I've put up some basic pictures of this redesigned He-Man sword on my DeviantArt page. I'll link it in the description if you want to download it, use it as reference, and I'm not copywriting this design at all, okay? So if anyone is drawing He-Man, making a He-Man, a remake of the live action or something like that, wanting to be more true to the original design, I release this design to anyone who wants to use it for free, because I'd much rather see them do it right than trying to claim an ownership over it. And let me just kind of reiterate in regards to my sword design, it's two-handed. It's a beefy, awesome two-handed sword. And, I mean, would He-Man be able to draw it from his back scabbard? Well, if he uses the right back scabbard, absolutely he could. So there we go. This is my in-depth analysis of the power sword from He-Man, and it's a special one for me because of the special place this sword holds in my heart. So this is a very important episode of Shadowversity for me. Thank you for watching. I hope you guys have enjoyed it as much as I have enjoyed making it for you. Of course, I hope to see you again as well. So until that time, farewell.